All right, let's jump right in today. We're going deep, deep into 1945.
A big year.
Huge. And to guide us, we've got, excerpts from a historical text. So get ready, because 1945, it's more than just the end of World War II.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's how most people remember it, sure. But when you look closer, there are so many changes, so many transitions, real stories about how all this global stuff impacted people.
Exactly. It's not just an ending, it's a beginning, too.
Right. Like a whole new world order was being set up.
So let's go back to the start of the year, January 1945. Germany's really feeling the pressure. Attacks from all sides. What was the mood like over there?
Oh, it was grim. Germany was on the defensive, resources were running out, and those Allied bombing campaigns, I mean, they were relentless. Morale was, well, it was pretty low.
Hmm.
But there was still, some defiance, this kind of desperate hope for a miracle turnaround. That's where things like Operation Nordwind and Bodenplatte come in.
Oh, yeah. Those were, I guess, desperate moves.
Exactly. Nordwind, that was a surprise attack in the Alsace region. It was a last-ditch effort, really, to mess up Allied supply lines, buy them some time.
Yeah.
And then Bodenplatte, that was a massive air attack, targeted Allied air bases,
Right.
a gamble to take out their air power. It didn't work, obviously, but it shows you how desperate the German high command was getting.
Still putting up a fight, though.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't going down easy.
Yeah.
But on the other side, the Allies were gaining ground. January saw the Soviets liberate in Warsaw, and then just days later, the world was confronted with the horrors of Auschwitz when the Soviet troops liberated the camp on January 27th.
That must have been a major turning point, not just in the war, but in how people saw the Nazis.
It was a pivotal moment for sure. The liberation of Auschwitz forced the world to face the true horror of the Holocaust. It strengthened the Allies' resolve to bring those responsible to justice.
And the Soviets weren't just stopping there, right? They were making moves for the final push against Germany.
Right. The Oder River crossing, February 1945, hugely significant. It put them within striking distance of Berlin. The pressure on Germany, imagine that, the enemy right on your doorstep.
The walls were closing in, and it wasn't just the big movements of troops. There were these individual stories happening too.
Oh, absolutely. Take Judge Roland Freisler. He was infamous, that Nazi judge known for his brutal rulings in the People's Court. Well, he was killed during a bombing raid on Berlin. And get this, he was trying to save court documents when it happened. It's ironic, to say the least, given all the death sentences he handed out.
Almost like poetic justice.
You could say that. It
Yeah.
really shows you the unpredictable nature of war, how individual fates can be decided by pure chance. And while that was happening in Berlin, over on the Western Front, something else was going down at the Ludendorff Bridge. During the Battle of Remagen.
The bridge that just wouldn't fall.
That's the one.
Yeah.
March 1945. The Allies, I mean, it was luck, really, but they managed to capture the bridge. It was a vital crossing over the Rhine. The Germans were going to blow it up, but they failed. And that unexpected victory, well, it allowed the Allies to get a foothold across the Rhine. It was a big advantage, sped up their advance into Germany.
So in Europe, things they're coming to a head. But we can't forget about what was happening on the other side of the world, right?
Absolutely. The Pacific War was raging. It was brutal. And the fighting, it was fierce. It was, driven by this desperation on the part of the Japanese forces. To understand how they fought, you have to consider their military culture. Honor, sacrifice. Those were big things.
It was a different kind of war in the Pacific, yeah.
Mhm.
But what does that mean in terms of how they actually fought?
The Japanese, they often used tactics that prioritized inflicting as much damage as possible, even if it meant huge casualties for themselves. They saw surrender as dishonorable, which led to incredibly tenacious resistance, even when defeat was certain.
Which brings us to, some of the most iconic and brutal battles of the war.
Exactly. Iwo Jima, the image of the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, it's seared into our memories. And then Okinawa. Oh, Okinawa. They called it the Typhoon of Steel. It was just grueling. These battles, they weren't just about land. They were about making a point,
Yeah.
fighting to the very end.
And those images, they really capture the intensity of it all. And of course, there's the sinking of the Yamato.
The Yamato. It was a symbol, really, of Japanese naval power, the largest battleship ever built. And its sinking in April 1945, it was a desperate attempt to defend Okinawa, really underlined how much Japan's resources, their options, were shrinking.
It's like they were throwing everything they had left at the Allies. And it wasn't just on the battlefields either. The firebombing of Tokyo, other Japanese cities, I mean, the civilian casualties were horrific.
Yeah, the firebombing campaigns, they were devastating. And they raise serious questions about targeting civilians. It's a grim chapter, one that forces us to think about the complexities, the moral dilemmas of war.
Speaking of moral dilemmas, there's that story from the Pacific that it always gets to me. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis in July.
Oh, the Indianapolis. It had just delivered parts for the atomic bomb. Then a Japanese submarine, a torpedo, it was sunk. A tragedy in itself. But then the aftermath, hundreds of sailors stranded in the water, sharks, days went by before they were found, communication errors. It's heartbreaking. And it highlights the human cost of war, even in its final days.
And that leads us to the next part of 1945, the atomic bomb.
The Indianapolis. It's a stark reminder of how destructive war is, how even in the closing days, tragedy can strike. But as we move into the second half of 1945, we see this story of devastation and rebuilding playing out everywhere on a global scale.
Yeah, it's like the world was holding its breath, trying to figure out what comes next. So much had happened already. Where do we even pick up on this historical roller coaster ride?
Let's go to Asia. While Europe was, starting to pick up the pieces, the end of the war had some big consequences for the balance of power in Asia, particularly in Korea.
Yeah.
And in Vietnam.
Oh, right. I vaguely remember this from school. Korea was under Japanese rule before the war, wasn't it?
Yes, for decades. And when Japan surrendered, it created this power vacuum. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, Soviets in the north, Americans in the south. It was supposed to be temporary, but, well, it solidified into two separate states. And that set the stage for the Korean War just a few years later.
It's kind of amazing how the seeds of future conflict were being planted, even as everyone was celebrating the end of World War II. What about Vietnam? It was a French colony, right?
Vietnam. That's an interesting one. During the war, the Japanese had kicked out the French colonial administration. So when Japan lost, a Vietnamese nationalist movement, the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, declared independence.
So they saw a chance, while France was weak, to break free.
Exactly. But the French, they wanted their colony back. And, well, this clash of interests led to the First Indochina War, another long, bloody conflict.
The world was really interconnected. What happened in one place had ripple effects everywhere else. But let's go back to Europe for a second. You mentioned the Cold War. How did that actually start to play out in 1945?
Well, as the Allies started putting those Yalta and Potsdam agreements into action, the cracks in the alliance started to show. They disagreed about the future of Germany, about the governments in Eastern Europe, about the overall balance of power.
And the Soviets, having lost so much fighting Germany, they wanted that buffer zone in Eastern Europe.
We did. They felt it was crucial for their security to protect them from future threats. And they believed that having communist-friendly governments in those countries would give them that security. But the Western allies, especially the U.S., they started to worry about Soviet expansion.
So you have these two ideologies clashing, basically dividing Europe in two. Were there any specific events in 45 that really showed these growing tensions?
Well, the Berlin blockade itself didn't start until 38, but you could see the tension building in 45. The Soviets, they wanted to solidify their control over Berlin, which was, right in the middle of their occupation zone. So they cut off all land access to the city.
Hold on. So West Berlin, which is controlled by the Western Allies, it was like completely surrounded by Soviet territory.
Yeah. The Soviets, they hoped to force the Western Allies out, but the U.S. and their allies, they responded with the Berlin Airlift, this massive operation where they flew supplies into West Berlin for over a year.
They flew in everything they needed. Wow.
Everything. Food, medicine, fuel, even coal, to keep the city running. It was a feat of logistics, and it became this symbol of Western resolve. It showed that they were ready to stand up to the Soviets.
So 1945, it wasn't just the end of World War II. It was the start of, well, a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. And like we've been talking about, the things that happened that year, the division of Europe, the rise of nationalism in Asia, they had a huge impact on history.
They did. And we're still feeling the effects of those events today.
Yeah.
What 1945 teaches us is that, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding how those past events shape the world we live in now. But, beyond those big stories of war and politics, it's important to remember the people. the individuals living through these huge changes.
That's so true with all that chaos, all that uncertainty. What was it like for everyday people? How did they deal with the aftermath of such a devastating war? Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big picture stuff, but what about the people? You know, the everyday folks living through all of this. What was it like for them?
Well, for a lot of people, the end of the war, it wasn't just this moment of pure celebration. It was the start of a whole new set of problems. In Europe, especially, millions of people were displaced, homes destroyed, families separated,
Hmm.
after years of conflict. I mean, the refugee crisis was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before.
It's hard to even imagine trying to help so many people.
Yeah. It was a massive undertaking. And the people who could go home, what did they find? Often their communities were just ruins, not enough food, infrastructure destroyed,
Mm.
and this overwhelming feeling of uncertainty about the future.
So it wasn't just about rebuilding physically. There's this emotional trauma too.
Right. Exactly. So many people had seen horrific things, lost loved ones, or they'd endured years of hardship. The war, it left these deep psychological scars, and those took a long time to heal.
It makes you wonder how people found the strength to keep going with all that loss and devastation.
Well, I think it was a few things. There was this sense of resilience, a determination to rebuild their lives and communities. People helped each other out. They shared what they had, and they found comfort in knowing that others had gone through the same things.
There's something really powerful about that, about the human spirit, you know, finding ways to survive and rebuild even when things are at their worst.
And, while the challenges were huge, there was also this feeling of hope for a better future. In Europe, the Nazi regime, that was over. People had a chance to create something new, a world without oppression, without violence.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1945, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to think about?
Well, first, I think it's really important to understand just how much changed in 1945. It was a year that marked the end of an era, truly, and the beginning of a new one. The world was reshaped, politically, geographically, even in terms of ideology.
And those changes, like we talked about, they had consequences that we're still dealing with.
Exact. And second, I think 1945 is this powerful reminder of what war really costs, not just in terms of lives lost, but also the damage it does to society, to the economy, to people's minds. It's a lesson we can't forget.
A tough lesson, but an important one.
It is. And finally, I think even with all the darkness, 1945 offers a little bit of hope. It shows us how resilient humans can be, our ability to rebuild, to create new systems, to try to make a world that's more just, more peaceful.
Like a complicated legacy, full of contradictions.
It is. So as you keep exploring the history of 1945 and beyond,
Hmm.
I encourage you to look at those individual stories, to think about all the different perspectives that shape this incredibly important year.
Well, it's been an amazing journey through 1945. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating and complex year.
My pleasure.
And to you, listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new about this pivotal year and about the impact it's had on our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.